Hello, I'm Venus with Galaxy Inc. And for this week's writing tips, we're going to be talking about D&D and the writer. Now, I have already told you guys that I am a huge geek. And one of the things that I do almost every other Saturday, and if you follow my Instagram, you'll see, is that I play D&D. I play with my husband, who is our dungeon master / game master, and I also play a human swashbuckler currently. It's a lot of fun. Now, we're going to talk about the writer in D&D. A while ago, I was at a friend's house, another fellow writer, and I was sitting in our living room, and I looked over and saw this, the D&D starter set, which seems super odd because she is not the type of person that I would consider someone who is really into D&D. And so I asked her why she had it on her shelf. And she said it's because that she heard that it is a good way to create characters, that if you might be struggling with like character creation. And I thought that was a really interesting concept and not one that I'd heard of. I know how to create characters in D&D, and I started thinking about like how would you use D&D to create a character, and why would you need that? Well, sometimes we get stuck, right? We don't know what we want to do, or we want to create a story around a character, but we just want to have some fun with it. You know, we're trying to think of something new. You need something to kind of jumpstart you, and get your mind going and what you can do. And so one of those ways is to create a character using D&D. Now, obviously, if you're not planning on playing a campaign, which is with a group of people, it'll be a little bit different than if you're creating a character just for fun. We do have a friend in our group who loves rolling. They call it rolling up a character, quite enjoys doing that and creating all these different kinds and doing backstories for them. But so we're going to talk a little bit about how that works though. If you have heard this concept that you can create a D&D character using one of these starter kits, let me show you how you can do that. So all of the starter sets come with 5 pre-generated characters, and these are their little character sheets. It'll tell you a little bit about some of their special abilities. It'll include, this is a human fighter, so what I play, although I'm much higher level than this now. A little bit of background into those characters, so, some history perhaps. Your parents live in a prosperous village of Thundertree, east of the city of Neverwinter, at the edge of Neverwinter Wood. So they're giving you a little bit of backstory for your character. You can create your own backstory. So one of the things you have to do though is you have to roll for what are called attributes. There's strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. For this fighter, he starts out with some higher ones, and so these are already pre-rolled. His charisma is pretty low. It's a 9. Then he has a wisdom of 13, so he's fairly wise, but not very cavalier. Intelligence is 11, so not super smart. Constitution's 15. That's good for a fighter. Fighters need to have good constitution. He has a dexterity of 16, which is very important for a fighter, and then strength, which is a 14. Now, if you were rolling up your own character, you would use a d20 dice, which I've got my own here. I have pink ones. I also have ones that look like little stars because, my obsession with stars and planets. You would roll the dice, and whatever the number is what you would roll the dice for, however many there are. 6. You roll it 6 times, and then you start assigning the numbers. So let's say you rolled a 6 and a 14 and a 20. 20s are good, really great. You would then assign those numbers in here. All right, and that's how you would start building a character. This is a good place to start, of course, with the attributes, because let's say you rolled a 6. We currently have somebody who's playing a half-orc barbarian, and she rolled a 6 in her 6 rolls that she had to do. And her 6 has to be assigned to something. Now, she's a barbarian, so she needs strength, so her highest roll needed to go towards the strength attribute that's at the top. But what about the other ones? And what do you do with a 6? So she played around with it a little bit and decided that the 6 would go to intelligence, which means her character is not very smart. In fact, she's really, really not smart. And so we have to deal with that when we're playing the game, because the character makes decisions based off of her intelligence, right? And if she's not very smart, then sometimes she makes decisions that aren't very intelligent decisions. It also means that the rest of the group has to help her a lot when it comes to puzzles or things that require anything but brute strength. That is how you start building a character. I created a character. I rolled really well when I created my fighter. And so I had a lot of really high numbers. And I made my character very charismatic and very dexterous. And he has some strength, but not exactly a whole lot of wisdom. And how that plays out when you're playing D&D or if you're building a character is that if I've decided my character doesn't have a lot of wisdom, then that means that my character, well, he might not make the wisest decisions sometimes. He's not dumb, but he sometimes makes bad decisions. And that's how you can start building. Now, of course, there's other attributes on here. There's things like armor class, which is when you're fighting, so you can determine, based on what you're wearing, how much somebody gets hit. I'm going to put my dice down. There's also several other things on here that include like personality traits, ideals, bonds, flaws. Flaws are really important. This one, the pre-generated flaws, I'm convinced of the significance of my destiny and blind to my shortcomings and risk of failure. Now, if you were creating a character based off of that, how would you play it? He's kind of smart, but not very charismatic. He thinks he's really good at stuff, and he doesn't have a fear of failure. What kind of character would do that? What kind of characters exist already or fit that kind of an archetype? What could you play around with? What kind of backstory would you give a character like that? Like, what would the psychological makeup be of a person who has no risk or fear of failure? How did they grow up? And this is how you start building these characters and using D&D as a way to do it. Now, there are many different types of characters in D&D, so you can play around with, elves and dwarves, kind of your classical Tolkien-esque fantasy characters. But even if you were just doing a human or a magic user, you have to look at those things and say, okay, if those are my character traits, then how would my character respond in certain situations? So let's say you're just a human fighter, you're not writing a fantasy story, you're writing a more modern, almost mystery, right? And this is the character that you have. He's a good fighter, but he also solves mysteries, but he doesn't have a fear of failure. Well, we can play around with that a little bit, and we could say that, he's really confident, and he's gained that confidence because he's actually won a lot of cases, and he's won a lot of cases because he's really good at it, but it makes him completely insufferable, and nobody wants to work with him. So we've created a Sherlock Holmes-like character, right? That is a way to build characters using this. If you decided that your character was very intelligent, very book smart, but maybe not very strong, then that means they're not going to be very good in a fight, but they might be really good with puzzles, and they might be able to help solve problems and stuff like that, but they're not very charismatic. Or maybe your character is super charismatic. A lot of times bards, in D&D, those are people who play music and they also have some magic. Maybe they're really charismatic, but they're not very strong. So, and that plays into when you're playing the game, actually. Maybe that character, we call them squishy. Maybe that character's more squishy, and so they stay in the back. They don't go up front, and they don't run into a fight, because if they did, they get killed really quickly. So we don't want to play around with that. If you want to go a little bit further, they call this the Essentials Kit. And this has a little bit more to it. There's another game. You get a new set of dice, get a couple of characters. They're in here. And you also get a screen. Again, my friend who had this sitting in the house had no intention of playing it. She wanted to create a character. And that is really what we're talking about here. We're talking about creating a character from scratch. Maybe you're a little stuck, or you don't know what to do, or you just want to have some fun with a fun way to create a character. So let's say I've decided I'm going to create a character. And I'm going to start from scratch. So you'll notice this is completely blank. There's nothing on it. I don't have an armor class. I don't have intelligence. And I'm going to roll my dice. My first dice roll was a 5. Oh boy. Another 5. This is bad. Oh, it's a 3. Oh, 7. A 12. And finally a 17. All right, so 12 and 17 are my highest numbers. That's a tough one. I think that maybe this would be a really good barbarian or kind of like a tank character that can go in and just fight. If I put the strength at 17, I'd have a really good fighter character, but obviously not very intelligent or charismatic or anything else. Or I could apply those high numbers to intelligence and wisdom and just have them be a terrible fighter. Now, this is D&D, so if I was working in a group of people, maybe we'd work together to try to come up with something. But if I was just playing around and wasn't worried about my group, then maybe I'd go with the more squishy character. I think that'd be fun to play around with and have a character who maybe gets into fights a lot or, is with a group of people that... they're really smart, but they're not much good at anything else. And they're not very charismatic, so people don't really want to talk to them that much. Then you add things like acrobatics and animal handling. So maybe I give a lot of points to animal handling. Now I've got a character who's very intelligent and wise, not a big fighter, but really likes animals, and they're really good with animals. It reminds me a lot of Tamora Pierce's Protector of the First series, and one of her characters wanted to be a knight, so she's actually a pretty good fighter, but she's also really good with animals, and that's really important to her. So that's a way to play around with it and create kind of these interesting and dynamic characters that maybe aren't who you would normally roll up. You wouldn't normally create a character like this. You wouldn't create a character who's slow or lumbering or not very intelligent. Maybe that's not what you normally would do. But now that you've got that character, what do you do with it? And how do you create a backstory? And, why is this character this way? So one of the things that I did with my fighter is that my fighter is very... wealthy and from a wealthy family, but he has 8 older brothers who are all fighters as well, and he doesn't really stick out. So he leaves to go far away where nobody knows his family or his brothers so that he can go on adventures and build up a name for himself, with the plan that one day he is going to go back, and he's going to go back with all these wonderful stories of his great deeds and everything that he's done. So that's kind of how I'm playing this character. When I play D&D, I play my characters of a guy who is not so concerned about money because he's got a lot of it because he's wealthy. And at any time he could go home. It's not like he can't. So he's just building stories. So for him, it's all about being flashy. And so that's how I play this character. I make this character very flashy because he's always trying to build up stories and then, tells them, and and he always exaggerates and stuff like that, but he's a nice guy. So this is a way to play with these characters. Now, something I have not talked about yet, and it is important, is that one of the choices that you have is to choose whether your character is lawful good, neutral good, chaotic good, neutral, lawful evil, chaotic evil. I don't think I've listed them all. I might try to put them up on the screen, but you get the point. There's a lot of different ones. That also plays a large factor in what your character does. My character is neutral good. So he does good stuff, but he doesn't necessarily always obey the law. He does what needs to be done in order to do good things. And so he's a good person intrinsically, but maybe doesn't obey the law to do it. So our campaign currently is in a city where there are a lot of orphans, and he feels really bad for them and wants to create an orphanage, but the people of the city don't care as much. And so he's kind of going through back ways to try to get it done. That is a way of building character and playing around with it. If you have a lawful evil character, that's a character who, they do bad stuff, and maybe they're a bad person, but they do it within the confines of law, and not necessarily the confines of the law the larger law, like police and the government, but maybe the law within like their own guild. So maybe they're a thief and they have a thief's guild, and so they have thief's honor kind of thing. And if they do thief's honor, then they obey that law. That's the law that they follow. And so when you create a character and you're rolling them up and you've got strength and you maybe made them really strong, but they're not so smart, or they're really smart, not so strong, very charismatic. And then once you've created this character, you've rolled them up, they've got their strength, they've got all their little attributes, they're good at animal handling, or, you know, they're a really good thief, or they're really sneaky and quiet, you know, whatever you choose to put. There's like numbers that you put into these slots. So again, showing you the blank sheets, there's these kind of blank areas where you can add in numbers. You only have a certain amount, but once you add them in, then you can start putting them into your world. So let's say that last video I talked about how I had a character in search of a plot. So let's say you have a plot in search of a character. You've got this great story idea, but you just don't have any idea of what kind of character would work well within the story, or you kind of have maybe one character but you need like 2 or 3 more. This is a good way to play around with that. Once you've created all these attributes and stuff, then you can ask, how would this character that I've created interact with the world that I have created? Whether it's a fantasy world, a sci-fi world, a mystery, you know, something set in a time period in the past, or maybe even just, you know, a modern contemporary story. Where does this character that you've now created fit in to that story? In the book Finder, it is a modern story with elf characters who live across the Veil. And so characters live in this town called Bordertown. And there's actually a whole bunch of short stories that the author wrote. And that story feels very much like taking a D&D character, an elf, and inserting them into our modern world, and then playing around with how that would look. You know, if you had a character that could use a little bit of magic, you know, what would they use that for? Would they use it for good or evil? Are they chaotic good? Are they neutral? Do they want to help people? Are they the kind of character who wouldn't help anybody unless it, you know, benefited them? And so that story always felt to me like taking a D&D character and inserting it into the modern world, and that's a lot of fun. And those kind of stories excite me a little bit. So, you know, even though this is like a very set way of creating a character, you can do this on your own without a D&D sheet. You know, write down some of those attributes: intelligence, strength, dexterity, charisma, and then determine what you think your character would be in those things. If you don't have an idea yet, roll a dice and see what happens. If you do have an idea, put those in and then start building the character from there. Are they good or bad? Do they follow the rules? Do they follow the rules of a bad organization or a good organization? Are they just kind of neutral? Are they chaotic and they get in fights all the time and, you know, things are crazy? You know, make those determinations and then start writing the backstory and really thinking about it. If this was a real person, what would lead somebody to be like this? You know, why would they be like this? What would the choices they have made up to this point have led them to where they are? You know, have they made those choices themselves, or were those things pushed upon them? You know, play around with those backstories, play around, and then when they start interacting with your story, you can keep asking yourself and going back to that page and asking yourself, how would my character interact in this moment? I know what I do, but that's not what my character would do. My character is different. My character is not necessarily me. Which is why I write, is to create characters that are not me and like create interesting stories that with characters that are dynamic and interesting and other people can relate to, and most importantly, seem realistic. And that's the most important thing about writing that backstory, is making sure that when you're making choices that they kind of follow the story that you have created for your character. If you don't have a backstory for your character, then they are missing something, which means that they're also going to have trouble dealing with the world. I get if you only meet one person one time. So let's say you bumped into a teacher in the story, you've only see her once at the beginning and once at the end. We don't need a whole backstory for that person. But if you introduce us to a character, and if, for example, I read a story recently that had a secondary character that I don't know anything about him. Like, I was editing the book, but there's no backstory for this character. I have no idea if they have parents. I don't know if they have a family. I don't know where they live. I don't know what they, I know what they do. Literally, that's it. Just their job. So that's really important that we play around with that and give that character backstory. And then you can pepper that in throughout the story, not heavily. That's why I'm not saying pepper, put it in there. Give us some hints of who these people are so that we understand some of their motivations and they make sense to us and they feel like real people. I also maybe secretly hope that you will get interested in playing D&D and that you will play around with creating characters and see what kind of characters you can roll up. I'd be really interested to know, if you do play, what you currently play and what level you are. Leave that in the comments below. I'd love to hear. Don't forget to press like and subscribe to our channel. We post new writing tips almost every Friday. I've been Venus with Galaxy Ink. I hope your writing is out of this world.